This is Glenn Robinson, President of the World Affairs Council of the Monterey Bay Area. I would like to welcome you to our newest edition of Quick Takes on International Affairs. Please enjoy this talk and do consider joining the World Affairs Council.
Broadly speaking, I'm supposed to talk about Brexit. And if by Brexit one means the day the actual Brexit took place, the actual break, then it's a little difficult to understand what happened before and after. So allow me to say a few words before the actual Brexit signature. As you may recall from at least my previous talk and things you've read, that the Brexit or Great Britain leaving was a very contentious discussion. But the contentious discussions didn't take place in a vacuum. In the years during which Brexit was discussed and slightly before, a number of things transpired in Europe. One of them had to do with us, the United States, in the sense that under the Trump administration, we disengaged in many ways from Europe. President Trump was quite hostile to NATO, the European Union. He was not particularly interested in developing the alliance between the United States and Europe that had existed since the Second War. The consequence of that was that European countries decided that maybe they can't count on the US as they had been since the Second World War, and they sort of need to look out for themselves. And this has had the impact, which is, of some interest, of getting the Europeans to do a number of things which had an impact on the post-Brexit discussions. First, saying we've got to rely on ourselves, and second, especially France, deciding, well, maybe we need our own security arrangements as well. But in general, the sort of US disengagement from Europe had an impact on Europe for the first time since the Second World War, saying, well, we like the US, we have many relationships with the US, but maybe we can't count on them forever. The consequence of that, at the point at which Brexit actually took place, was that there was then the breach with Great Britain. And of course, the breach with Great Britain is still in train. That is to say, there was this treaty, there were arrangements about how to deal with Northern Ireland and Ireland. That's fairly complicated, but in any event, there's concern that the country of Ireland is a member of the EU, but Northern Ireland, of course, is part of Great Britain, so arrangements needed to be made to smoothly allow the two countries to trade with each other and so on. And the other thing that is noteworthy is that when Brexit was signed, there were some agreements, but hundreds of thousands of aspects of disengaging Great Britain from the EU did not take place at that point, and to this day has not taken place, because there are thousands of little regulations that have to be changed, that have to be homogenized or altered entirely, and no one really knows exactly how this is going to play out. So that from the perspective of Britain, the pro-Brexit people were happy that Brexit has taken place, but neither those British folks nor the anti-Brexit people really have a very clear idea as to where this is all going to go, because it's not at all clear that that the details of which, I mean, exactly how much cocoa does chocolate have to have in it, and if it doesn't have the right amount, now that the Great Britain is no longer a member of the EU, in order to demonstrate how much cocoa is in chocolate, paperwork needs to be filled out. And so we're currently going through a phase in which a tremendous amount of uncertainty exists. Also, a tremendous amount of paperwork at the borders to execute at least the intentions of Brexit. And this was all taking place while new Prime Minister Johnson was on uncertain terrain politically for a variety of reasons. And it was the sort of Conservative Party, it's certainly the populists in England, including many members of the Conservative Party, who wanted to take this move, but who were not at all capable of knowing how these details would play themselves out. So let me drop that for a minute and say then that you have the next layer of problems, and that is COVID. Because in the midst of Brexit, you have COVID in Europe, and COVID was handled very badly in the early days in Britain, but subsequently and now has been handled very well. And in the meantime, the reverse has happened in Europe, namely relatively few people were vaccinated. I think the figures are, at this point, as we're speaking, 58% of all folks in Great Britain have been vaccinated and only 14% in Europe. And so why is this, and what does this mean for Europe in the post-Brexit era? Well, one of the things that it means was that there was this notion that the 26 remaining countries of the EU could act in unison and in a coordinated fashion. And with that in mind, the head of the European Commission decided that it was the European Commission which would manage vaccinations and distribution and so forth. And as it turns out, the European Union had absolutely no capacity, or very little capacity, I may be exaggerating, to do anything of the sort. So that immediately the allocation of vaccines and the distributions of vaccines and the lockdowns in various countries became a monumental mess in Europe, and it still is. And what has, therefore, rather than the togetherness of the EU, which sort of seemed to be the outcome of Brexit, has in a sense frayed, because the European countries have said, well, you know, we're having all these COVID problems, but Brussels is not handling this well. We're going to do this ourselves. So what used to be a kind of unity in the face of negotiating Brexit has come to a disunity in the face of COVID in Europe. And that is quite serious because it has frayed the European Union. So on the one hand, you have England with the United Kingdom, Great Britain, without really having to come to face with what Brexit means for them in terms of trade, in terms of the economy and so forth. Uncertain days economically are ahead for Great Britain. And on the other hand, the unity of the European Union, which seemed to be the outcome of Brexit, has frayed under COVID. And now you have a big mess in Europe. A big mess nationally, as nationalists and populists in all the countries say, the hell with the European Union, we are going to manage these things on ourselves. And as you know, there is free movement amongst European countries. Well, in the face of lockdown, some of these things are not so free, and people are calling for more rigid borders in various countries. So you have sort of three strands here. You have the strand of Europe feeling somewhat disaggregated from the United States, moving into Brexit, a victory for the European Union, as most folks saw it, in negotiating Great Britain out of Brexit, that is to say, not making too many compromises for Great Britain. Great Britain is celebrating it being out of the European Union, but not having any clear idea as to the details of what this means, and more importantly, what it means in the next 2 or 3 years in terms of its economy, in terms of the satisfaction of people in Great Britain who all of a sudden can't move around as freely, can't go to universities on the continent automatically, and so forth. And you have national leaders of various countries, in a sense, reasserting themselves in the European Union over the head of the European Union bureaucracy in Brussels. And that has led now to a fair amount of uncertainty and disarray all over Europe. Because among other things, the most prominent European leader for the European Union, as well as for Europe in its relationship with the rest of the world, was Angela Merkel. And Angela Merkel is about to leave office, and it is unclear, of Germany, it is unclear who will replace her. And the potential replacement don't look very promising. And her party, the CDU, looks like it may lose the next election, and there may be a coalition of other parties and so on. Now, how has this come about? It's come about in some senses because of COVID. The mismanagement of COVID and people's anger about the management of COVID has not only led them to say, plague on the European Commission, which mishandled this, and on everybody else, but also plague on Brussels. And why should we be paying so much attention to Brussels? We put all our eggs in the basket of Brussels, and now Brussels is malfunctioning. Ditto in other European countries. France leaps to mind. The French government is also in some disarray over its handling of COVID. Many countries in Europe don't really want to hand lead to France as Germany fades because of Angela Merkel's retirement. And so smaller countries in Europe are uncertain what this all means in terms of the European togetherness and the importance of Europe acting in unison and acting together. So there are lots and lots of problems emerging and as we speak in Europe. And let me enumerate them one more time. Brexit has taken place. It took place in the face of what appeared to be a victory for the 27 remaining countries in Europe. COVID came along. Brexit came along. COVID made a mess out of the capacity of the EU to handle COVID and the movement of vaccinations amongst the European Union. In the meantime, some countries have decided that they can't count on either the British or the American or anybody else's vaccines and are looking to Russia and China. Furthermore, there are strands of policy differences in Europe that have emerged during and post-Brexit. One of them, again, traces back to Trump administration and its hostility towards China, which has been continued so far under the Biden administration, because a number of European countries, not least of Europe, have very close trading ties with China, and therefore want to be careful in how they negotiate and treat China. So as the US, under 2 administrations, is calling for human rights violations and dressing down the Chinese for one thing or another, and I'm not saying what they're doing is invalid. I am simply saying, or their criticism of China aren't necessarily invalid, but what I am saying is that many European countries say, whoa, there might be a better way to deal with China. We could have better negotiations. We could criticize on the one hand, but align our interests on the other hand. And what this is a symbol of is something I mentioned earlier, namely that during the Trump administration, the European Union took on a sense of self-empowerment, that they can't just follow the US or rely on the US, they need to do their own thing, as we would say. And so at the moment, you have a situation where the Biden administration is continuing to speak fairly hostily about China, hostily about the Soviet, that's Russia, and where the European countries are saying, no, actually, we have linkages with Russia and linkages with China. There are areas of disagreement and criticism, but we need to have better negotiations with them and not just criticize them. So you have a kind of trification. You have, on the one hand, continental Europe, on the other hand, now the Great Britain, and on the hand, the United States. And continental Europe, the United States and Great Britain used to be the closest of allies and alliances who would typically homogenize their policies to the rest of the world. And that has begun to show cracks. And that is actually fairly interesting and fairly serious, and how this will unwind in the next few years is unclear. But let me just end by saying that on top of the various differences within Europe, for example, the criticism of Hungary and the authoritarian leadership of Hungary, versus the more democratic states, and the bigger countries versus the little countries, and different kind of populations, different policies in the past and in the present to immigration, for example. You have all of these kinds of differences, but they have played themselves into these cracks. And the cracks, to just summarize, are on the one hand, a weakened European Union, because of COVID and its mismanagement of COVID, a strengthened Britain in a way, superficially because of its very good handling of COVID, especially in the most recent past, and the United States that has said to Europe, we're back. And we are back, you know, there was the Trump administration, but now we're back. We value our alliances with you. We want to go back to the pre-Trump era. And the European countries are saying, not so fast, maybe. We think of you as our closest allies, but we've discovered that we have different national interests. And these national interests need to be addressed maybe under the umbrella of the European Union, maybe on a bilateral level, and so forth. And so what I can report, I think, is that the situation in the post-Brexit era in Europe has become quite messy within Europe, has become quite messy with Great Britain with respect to Europe, and it is far from clear exactly to what extent the genie can be put back in the bottle of the close alliances between the United States and Europe, both Britain and the European Union, and going back to, in a sense, the pre-Trump era. I don't think that's exactly going to happen, but you know, one can imagine different scenarios. But things are happening very rapidly in Europe, pushed along by COVID, pushed along by changes in politics like Merkel's retirement, who will be leading the European countries. Can it really be France? Other countries don't want it to be France. So we're entering a fairly messy, not necessarily very dangerous, but a fairly messy realignment. And so it bears watching. And if we revisit this issue in, let us say, a year, I'm sure things look very differently. But it certainly is interesting, and I invite you to listen to the news and read the New York Times and so forth, to see as these various strands of Brexit, Brexit Europe, post-Brexit Europe, Trump era, post-Trump era, Great Britain, pre-Brexit, post-Brexit, they're all sort of floating around, and it is a very movable and uncertain future. Thank you very much for attending this, and hope to talk to you again. Thank you.